So Theo is asking, Genesis 19 and Judges 19 are eerily similar. What's up with this?
I absolutely love this question, my friend Theo. And I'll tell you why, because I want to say I might have noticed this a long time ago when I was studying the Bible as well. And here's my 2 cents on the matter. So, and when you look at the books of Genesis and you look at the books of Judges, now the book of Genesis is all about the creation of the world and the fall of man, and basically how God is just trying to find a lineage of people that are not going to disobey him. But basically, most of the book of Genesis is about the fall and, the destruction of the world through the flood. And, the only line is like Noah, and then only two of his sons, and then only, Abraham and his sons, and even they were kind of messed up. And so you just see, though, like most of the world, it's a very worldly centered book, like talking about all the sins that were going on in the world. You see the Tower of Babel. You see, again, like the flood, the thoughts of their heart were only evil continually. So you see the evil in man. And you see specifically in chapter 19, like you're reading, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in a story that takes place, I believe, in Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's go ahead and go there to Genesis chapter 19. And I think this is why I think they're both in the same chapter. And I'll tell you in just a minute. So I'll give you a little bit of suspense. So basically, in verse 1, it gives you the context of kind of what's going on. It says, now 2 angels came in to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. So we know Lot is the nephew of Abraham. And Lot is mentioned as a righteous man, but he was living in a very bad city called Sodom. And as you probably know, Sodom and Gomorrah, these twin cities, were inevitably destroyed because they were just so full of evil and just the worst kinds of evil. And so now it says, now 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose up to meet them and bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way. So I kind of thought about that. Why would Lot asked them to come into his house in the evening. Well, I believe that Lot knew at night bad things happened in his city of Sodom. And that's exactly what we see. And so I'll just kind of summarize the story, which I'm sure you already know. But basically, it's what happens is these men in Sodom saw the angels as well, and they saw them go to Lot's house. And so they go banging on his door. And you see basically in verse 3, he said, so he insisted, verse 4, sorry. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, so these are worldly men, old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. In verse 5, it says, they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally. So they wanted to rape these angels. I mean, how twisted is this? They saw, God's glory in these angels. I'm sure they were, they had a different demeanor, a godly, sweet, kind demeanor. And they were like, let's abuse them in this way. Let's sodomize them. That's why it was called Sodom, because they were known for sodomizing. And it was just kind of a sad situation. And so Lot is pleading with these men, basically saying, don't do this. And he's so out of desperation. He says something I don't think he should have said, but basically in verse 8, he says, see, now I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they came under the shadow of my roof. And so, this is just kind of a sad situation where we see these wicked men surrounding, the righteous man's house, trying to, have sexual intercourse with these 2 angels, which they assume are, men. And in verse 9, it says, and they said, stand back. And then said they, then they said, this one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with him. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break the door. And in verse 10, but the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were in the doorway and the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary of trying to find the door. So basically, thank God, God makes a miracle happen. And these men are struck with blindness and they can't figure out, how to get into Lot's house. And so they're not able to rape these angels. Now, so basically, there's more to this story, but the summary of it is basically that God was saying, we're going to destroy this city. It is too wicked at this point. And there was even more wickedness than this going on. It wasn't just sodomy. It actually, the Bible says in another part of the Bible that the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were fullness of bread and idleness. And so, it was just a culture of debauchery. It was just doing whatever you felt like, whether it was, forcing yourself on somebody sexually or, just being a glutton, being selfish and lazy. It was a lot of things. So basically, the rest of the chapter talks about the destruction of Sodom as well as Gomorrah. So here we see basically the comparison story of these worldly sodomite men, surrounding a house and trying to rape angels. And I totally appreciate your thoughts or your picking up on this, how it's a similar story, and it happens to be in the book of Judges in the same chapter. So let's go there to Judges 19. And I'll summarize this story because I know I'm taking a while, and I know this is a bit of a long story, and this story breaks my heart. I'm sad that it's in the Bible because I know it's true, but I think God, didn't put it in the Bible because he approves of it. I think God put it in the Bible to teach us something. And I think you're really onto something when you see that they're both chapter 19. And I'll tell you again, I'm going to leave you in suspense until the end. So Judges 19 is basically, there was a Levite. And just to give some context, so the book of Genesis, like we said, it's the first book of the Bible, and it's basically from the creation of man and going through all the sins of men, and just as God finding just a small lineage of godly people in a sinful world. Like we said, there was Enoch and then Noah and Abraham. And it kind of ends around the time of Joseph. And then basically God's people go into Egypt as slaves. And then we see the rest of Exodus, where God's people have been in slavery for hundreds of years, and then God sends the deliverer, who is Moses, to deliver them. And the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are kind of the story of God's people coming out of Egypt and creating and going to the promised land in order to set up a nation. So what we see is the next chapter after that, or the next book after Deuteronomy, we see at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies and a man named Joshua takes over as the leader of Israel. And we see how this wonderful leader, Joshua, was a godly man, and he, wanted to, preserve God's character and worship God the right way. And what you see, though, is what is so sad is the next chapter is a book of Judges. So it's basically 7 chapters after the book of Genesis. And what we see in the book of Judges is basically it's a book where it's God's people and they're in the promised land, but they really aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And they pretty much fall back into sin pretty quickly. And by the time you get to the chapter 19 in the book of Judges, I mean, there was a lot of things messed up going on. Like you see earlier in the book of Judges, you see Samson, having to deliver God's people from, the Philistines because, the people sinned. And so God, let their enemies take over. Sorry, I know I'm giving you a lot of details. But then when you finally get to chapter 19, you see a story of this Levite. And I think God puts this here as an epitome of the depth of evil that God's people had fallen into. In the book of Genesis, chapter 19, you see the world, and you expect that from the world because they don't honor God. They don't follow God. People in Sodom were not there to worship the Lord. They had no connection to God whatsoever. They had completely rejected God. They did whatever they felt like. But in the book of Judges, this was supposed to be God's people, set up setting up a nation that God was planning to bless, but yet God's people were falling back into the same sins of the world. And I really think that that's why it's the same, very similar story. And so I'll just summarize it really quick. Judges 19. And it says, in 19, it says, it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel that there was a certain Levite. So we know Levites, they were of the few of God's righteous people serving in the sanctuary. And it says, a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. So basically, he married this lady who was supposed to be, a Jewish woman. She was from Bethlehem and Judah. And then verse 2, it says, but his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and there was there 4 whole months. So here we see a woman of God who's supposed to be a woman of God, but she's acting like a harlot or a prostitute. She's being, promiscuous, and she's, committing adultery on her husband. And so this Levite man actually goes out to bring her home. He still reaches out to her. He still wants her. And he finally, but her father plays this game of like, no, just stay a little longer. Let her stay. She really doesn't want to go, And so finally, it comes to be nightfall on, after several days. And in verse 9, it says, when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young man's father, said to him, look, the day is now drawing toward evening. So again, we see that evening language. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early so you may get home. And verse 10, though, he says, however, the man was not willing to spend that night. So he arose and departed and came opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. With him were the 2 saddle donkeys, and his concubine was also with him. And so basically, what we see here is this story of he leaves this area to another city to try to get out of to bring his concubine back. And if you keep going. It's very similar story to what you just read in Genesis chapter 19. And it says in verse 22, it says, as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, again, this is Judges 19:22, perverted men surrounded the house, same thing, and beat on the door. Very similar. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man. So basically, the Levite and his concubine stopped by another man's house. He was a godly man, and it says, bring out the man who came to your house that we may know him carnally. Same thing. They wanted to rape this Levite. Now, these were not Sodomites. These were not worldly people. These were God's people. These were supposed to be Israel. This is in Bethlehem where Jesus was born. Can you imagine? And yet we see the same.
Wait, was that Bethlehem or Gibeah?
Oh, sorry. You're right. She was from Bethlehem. No, she was from Bethlehem. They were coming out of Bethlehem, though. But
Yeah.
I mean, I
think they're in Gibeah, which is territory of the Benjamites. Which
you're right,
may have
but
been
even
close to Bethlehem.
Yeah, but even still, these are supposed to be God's people.
Yeah.
And so, basically, in verse 23, it says, but the master of the house, went out and said, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly, seeing this man has come to my house. Do not commit this outrage. Here's my virgin daughter. Same thing, same act of desperation. And so what ends up happening is the man is like, I don't want him to throw out his poor virgin daughter. So he actually takes his concubine, who, was not a good girl, who was, sleeping around for months and months.
We don't know that, right? We just know she was a concubine.
Oh, you're right. She was his wife? Is that what you're saying?
No, she was a concubine. We just know she was his concubine, right? But we don't know we don't really know she was being promiscuous.
Well, it says she played the harlot.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, it said
I've always missed that.
In the beginning of it said her husband, verse 2, it says, but his concubine played the harlot against him. So it's pretty clear. She was fooling around it says for 4 months, and she didn't want to leave. So she was not converting out, like saying, oh, my husband's here for me, I want to go back. No, she was like, no, I really don't want to. She wanted to live in sin. And so he actually throws the concubine out. And then sadly, the men of, these men who were supposed to be, Israelites, rape her so badly that she actually dies. And it's a little bit different as far as the outcome. And then but at the end of the story, the Levite ends up cutting her into 12 pieces and sending her to the 12 tribes of Israel. And just as a message, like, this is what we've come to as a people. We need to change. And so basically, long story. I know, I'm sorry. I went
Yeah,
way
I mean,
over
it
what
gets
I
to the point where
thought.
like it's like peak evilness, right? I think it's what
Yeah,
it's trying to compare
exactly.
to. They've reached peak evilness, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, and something needs to be done about it.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is, the reason I think they're both in chapter 19 is I think God wanted to show his people, like, hey, just because, you're in the church doesn't mean the same stuff doesn't happen in the church that happens in the world. And so I really think that we have to be so careful as Christians to understand that, just because we're in church, that doesn't mean we're safe, that as if, we're not going to be tempted to sin, or that there's not people tempted to sin around us. We have to be on our guard, and we have to be focusing on, what's important, which is a solid relationship with Jesus, so that we don't go astray just because one sin gone unchecked is just going to lead to the next. And we're going to be in the same boat as we see these Sodomite people. We're going to end up needing destruction. But praise God, with his people, he will be merciful if we repent. So that is my message to you. I'm sorry, again, it's a little long there, but any other
Yeah, I
thoughts,
mean,
guys?
there are long passages. There's just so many similarities. It's like really
Yeah.
go read both chapters side by side. It's incredible.